As we start a new year, it's a good time to look back at last year and learn some lessons. Of course, each year brings its own set of wins, challenges, and lessons to learn, and 2023 was no exception. It was an extraordinary year, wasn't it? Remember only a couple of years ago when our attention was focused on COVID-19 and the impact that its lives had, and then in 2022, property values started falling, interest rates started rising. Well, I think the memory of 2023 is going to be, it'll be a year when our housing markets were affected by booming immigration, and that led to a shortage of dwellings, causing property values and rents to rise. However, looking back at this time last year, who would have thought we'd have had so many interest rate rises, inflation would remain as stubbornly high, yet unemployment would remain at historic lows, and our housing markets, despite all these challenges, would be as resilient as they were. And of course, there were wars overseas, one lasting 2 years and another in the Middle East. Nobody could have foreseen all that happened, including the severe slump in consumer confidence that affected us in 2023. I guess that was a lot because of the economic uncertainty. But now, as we head into 2024, I can't help reflect on what Australia as a country has accomplished, what I've achieved personally, what I've overcome, and the lessons I want to carry into this new year. So I'm looking forward to my regular chat with Australia's leading housing economist, Dr. Andrew Wilson, Chief Economist of My Housing Market, to hear his reflections on what were the major influences on our housing markets last year. Hi, Andrew.
Yes, good day, Michael. It was a big year, wasn't it? 2023. Isn't every year a big year in terms of what how the housing market performs? But it was an interesting year. Perhaps we can talk about lessons learned, question mark, were they learned, will they be learned, or was it just be another year of the same old mistakes, the same old, I guess, issues that drive the market, particularly the almost addictive nature of the negativity around the prospects for housing markets that we get year in, year out. We've already sort of started that. And again, 2023 was a year of really revealing the ridiculous predictions that were made in 2022 regarding 2023. And but it hasn't stopped those that make those negative predictions from doing them again. But I think we don't blame those that take advantage of that clickbait. It's really the people who buy it, those that listen to it. And it does make you a little bit cynical and a little bit sad, really, about that part of the populace that tends to continue to buy into all the nonsense regarding negativity.
Well, one of the lessons I learned many years ago, Andrew, was that it's not the media's job to educate us.
No.
In some ways, it's the media's job to entertain us. Really, it's more their job to get our eyeballs onto their websites or buy their newspapers because they've already got advertisers who've paid for the space. And I guess it's really hard to come up with good news stories all the time. It's much easier to come up with bad news stories, and people love reading that clickbait, don't they?
Well, that's right, Michael, and that's the whole point. It's clickbait. Now, if it wasn't clickbait, it wouldn't be produced, it wouldn't be promoted. And the point is that people will read it and to some degree absorb it and believe it. Now, if that wasn't occurring, then the media just wouldn't bother because it wouldn't be clickbait, whether it's online media or television or whatever. They wouldn't be bothered with these types of headlines if people were just dismissing it as rubbish.
Well, the first one this year, Andrew, was 6 interest rate cuts in the next 2 years by the CBA Bank. Now, they're the ones who just over 12 months ago told us our property market was going to fall more than double-digit growth. There's no accountability. And I guess they've got all the economists, they've got banks of people, actually, that's not meant to be a pun, pouring through all the data, coming up with information. But boy, they were wrong. So why should we believe them this time?
Well, we shouldn't, Michael, because they've been consistently wrong. This isn't just a one-off. We've seen the banks who you would have thought would have been particularly focused on accurate predictions in the housing market because that's their business. Look, the concern is that their agenda setting with their pronouncements, that it's not about what they believe, or it's either that or they're completely ignorant. Because how do you go cycle after cycle getting it so wrong? It's not just the level of decline or growth that they're missing out on. They're missing out on the actual direction. They're saying down when it goes up. And it's just really concerning when we have just four big banks in charge of our financial sector, and they seem to be completely incompetent in terms of their economic insights, particularly into the housing market.
Well,
Is
you've
there
got
a
me
lesson
worried now,
there?
Andrew, because all the banks think property values are going to go up. So maybe they're going to be wrong. But I know just recently we did your end of year recap where you similarly thought property values are going to go up. But it's not as simple as that. There isn't one Australian property market. So CBA said they're going to go up 5% over the year. There's obviously going to be some winners and losers in the housing market this year.
Well, yes, but I think a reasonably educated 11-year-old would come up with that sort of a forecast anyway. It's all right to start to measure the trend. Anybody can do that when it's clearly moving in a singular direction. But it's where we get these outside forces, such as higher interest rates or real issues that impact demand and the housing market. That's where the real ability lies in determining what's going to happen going forward. I mean, as I said, a reasonably educated, bright 11-year-old could predict what's going to happen in the housing market next year, notwithstanding, of course, any outside forces that we can't predict. So I'm not sure we should give the banks a pat on the back that they're predicting higher prices next year. If they, or this year, if they got that wrong, we really would be starting to ask the government, what can we do about these incompetent banks? But look, at the end of the day, we've had these issues over the last 4 or 5 years that have been difficult because they have come from left field, difficult in terms of forecasting outcomes in the housing market. And that, of course, is fertile ground for the doomsayers because there is that level of uncertainty. So that straight away they head off to the push the clickbait button, which is house price crash, even though we haven't had any house price crashes in this country, certainly in the modern era where we've got robust data sets to measure. But I think that we all realise that, and it's almost a bit of a joke. People go, oh, ha, ha, the bank's got it wrong again. Oh, ha, ha, these got it wrong again. The media got it wrong again. Oh, ha, ha. Well, that's fine. But if you've made an investment decision based on these predictions of the last 4 or 5 years, Michael, then you would certainly have suffered. I think when we look at the underlying factors, not just with the banks, and the banks have their own agenda, and I think the big lesson we should learn, the government should learn, is that there needs to be some sort of new competitive elements put into our financial sector just to keep the banks honest in terms of their service to consumers. And just on that, I mean, our mortgage rates are now a percent higher than where they were a decade ago, Michael, and yet our official interest rate is around about a percent lower. So that means that the banks have taken advantage and increased their margins over the past decade. We should really have the banks following what the Reserve Bank does in terms of higher or lower interest rates. They haven't done that. They've taken advantage over that 10-year period by pushing up their margins. So the government should wake up to this and undertake some sort of protocols to ensure that the consumer is looked after, given that the banks have really a free ride to massive profits because of the fact that they have so much market power. But I do think, moving beyond the banks, that it was an interesting year for the interest rate cycle. Of course, interest rates increased for the first time in a decade in 2022, May 2022. It was a response, a global response to the breakout in inflation, which was a direct result of all the stimulus packages that governments used in the face of the COVID pandemic. So no surprise we had inflation raise its ugly head, too much demand, not enough supply. And of course, the solution to inflation, if we open up our economic textbooks, which are looking pretty dusty and ragged at the moment, that we raise interest rates to quell demand. So we started that cycle. But other than the initial phase, Michael, really nothing happened in terms of what consumers were thinking. I mean, consumers have had a very big year in 2023. I scratched my head at some of these surveys that said it was a poor year for consumers. We've had a massive year for consumers. Consumer spending is held up at the same levels as it did through the pandemic stimulus period. House prices have gone up double figures. All the signs, the stock market's improved, of positive consumerism.
Jobs created. Anyone who wants a job could get a job. Wages went up.
Wages went up at record levels. And yet we have these very confusing surveys which tell us that consumers are negative. I think that we've really got to start thinking about the validity of these surveys. We see them wrong regarding election outcomes. And now, quite clearly, the real data in terms of what's happening with consumers doesn't reflect what the polls are telling us. A gangbusters housing market, gangbusters retail sales, and strong stock market. As I said, I think that was maybe the head scratcher into 2023 was that despite 13 increases in interest rates, consumers and the housing market continued to move ahead. And I think really we've got to look at the reasons why. And I think it's logical. Firstly, interest rates started at zero, Michael. So we were coming from the lowest possible base. And even though they were increasing, they were at the lowest level basically that we've had. We also had lots of money in the bank, wages were rising.
People had stashed their COVID bonuses, stashed their money, and so they came into this period with the biggest savings buffers that they had in their bank accounts, in their offset accounts, prepaid their mortgages than we've seen in a long, long time, Andrew.
That's right. So they had capacity to continue to spend, Michael, despite month after month of interest rate increases. So we were coming from a record low base in terms of where our interest rates started. And that was the whole point. We had to get to a point where people couldn't reach into their bank accounts and continue to spend. We haven't got there yet. This is the issue.
I guess it's also, Andrew, interest rates don't affect everybody the same way, do they? They affect mortgage holders and investors more to a degree than tenants, and that there's a whole generation of baby boomers who don't even have a mortgage anymore. And that's been in the media a bit also, that they're spending up and they're even giving money, bringing it forward, their inheritance forward to the bank of mum and dad, helping a lot of people into the property market at the moment.
Well, that's right, Michael. But as I said, I mean, when we look at that, the doom and gloom scenarios around higher interest rates, you have to take the context of why, firstly, we're getting higher interest rates and where they're coming from. And the reason we had that concerted period of higher rates was just because our economy was so strong. We had to slow down spending. And I think that the first lesson that was learned was that, or should have been learned, question mark, is that we paused interest rates way too soon. I think the Reserve Bank, which has really been struggling with its credibility over a number of years now, Michael, reached the point where the government had to do something. And we've had what's an unprecedented change to the structure of the Reserve Bank. The governor wasn't renewed, and it's going to be a whole different ballgame this year for the Reserve Bank. I'm not so sure the changes are going to make any difference. I'm concerned that the current governor and the current board are really following the previous boards, previous governors' policy positions, particularly in regard to the housing market, which I'm very concerned at. We can talk about that shortly. But I think that was the point, that the previous jurisdiction paused interest rates in the middle of the year, which was a confounding decision, given there was absolutely no sign that we'd slowed the economy down. And yet they were saying, oh, we want to take this wait and see approach. It was a guess, Michael. They were just guessing that perhaps something had happened. They were looking back thinking, oh, we don't want to create a recession. There's another prediction that went woefully wrong this year also, Michael, for 2023. And that was all those that predicted a recession in this country in 2023. We ended up having a very strong year, or certainly a relatively strong year in terms of our economic output. Similar scenarios in the US, where many predicted, in fact, just about everybody predicted a recession in the US, and they all got it wrong. But as I said, I think that the problem was that they paused interest rates too soon without any sign that the economy was slowing down. In fact, the signs were that the economy was actually increasing in terms of its strength, particularly the labour market. We had a record September quarter for wages growth for the year to the September quarter, all-time record 4% increase in wages. And yet the policymakers, Reserve Bank, kept trying to put it off and say, well, we're looking at this measure, not that measure. And I think that was really a big mistake. And of course, they validated the fact that it was a mistake that they paused too early by raising rates again on Melbourne Cup Day, because they realised that the rates hadn't done anything. And yet it was the sort of weasel words, oh, well, we said we might have to raise rates again, but they give themselves plenty of wriggle room. I think that our rates are still too low. This talk of cutting rates next year, let's see how those... I think the only reason we'll cut rates is if we get some sort of an outside force that creates an economic downturn, and we'll need to stimulate scenarios. There's this sense that we have some sort of a rate which has to apply, and that currently we're at sort of a stimulatory rate or a non-stimulatory rate, and we have to cut it back to get back to normal, whatever normal is. And again, it's all about, in my opinion, those taking a position and wanting to have some sort of movement in the rate market, because they want people to start taking positions, and that means money, particularly the banks. It worries me also that this year is now we're moving into an election cycle in both Australia and the US. And you're just thinking, well, maybe there's a hesitancy at some level, who knows, about going harder with interest rates when you do have these, not that the central banks are engaged in that, but there's certainly a lot of political agendas now about trying to keep interest rates lower perhaps than they need to be. As I say, I still think that there's more upward pressure than downward pressure on the interest rate outlook. But having said that, I don't think it's a material force in the housing market as we saw last
What
year.
about migration, Andrew? A lot of people are complaining that we're bringing too many people in. There was around 518,000 net overseas migrants during the last financial year, which is an all-time record. They say they're going to bring it down a bit. There was a lot of temporary visa holders and students coming back to Australia as well. And then there was the internal migration also, people moving back from regional areas back to urbanisation, and more people moving to Queensland. That affected our housing markets.
Well, again, Michael, this is can we not learn some lessons about taking the context of these changes in migration? The government's already made knee-jerk reactions. And as I said, they're under a lot of pressure because they're not doing well in the polls. They are moving into an election cycle. We're seeing a little bit of those thought bubble type policies coming out now in regard particularly to the housing market, which has a lot of issues, as we know. But I think the migration factor, our numbers are really what they traditionally have been, Michael. We're not really getting anything more. It's just that we don't have any net outflows from the temporary visas. We've certainly had a lot of an increase in tourism, which means temporary visas, but the student visas are around about what they were. It's just that we're getting them all coming in, and those that would have completed their courses and their qualifications aren't leaving because they haven't been coming in for the last 3 years. The ones that are coming in now complete their qualifications. Of course, we'll get back to the normal net position. It's all in and not out at the moment, Michael. That's why we're getting big numbers. And I'm not sure it's wise to start to think about impact a very big sector of the economy, which is higher education. Start to think about controlling that to control what's been the big mistakes of governments in terms of their infrastructure position for housing, which has been the cause of these high rent scenarios, or not scenarios, but outcomes. So yes, they're reducing temporary visas to try to, which I guess you've got to do, but it's taking with one hand and giving with the other, because the university sector will suffer because they're not worried about the net position, they're worried about the in position. And if it's reduced, it'll mean reduced income for our higher ed sector. So, I also don't think that has had a really significant effect on our housing markets. The margin, yes, perhaps some markets, but I think it's just the general catching up with all the imbalances of recent years that have caused particularly the rental crisis. And again, the lessons learned haven't been learned. The government's still looking at the same old solutions, which are now being recognised in Western Europe, which has more of a left-wing social housing structure that we've been trying to copy, which is nonsense given we have a completely different housing environment. We've been trying to copy that for a number of years, and they're now bailing out of that because it's failed, and they're seeing political repercussions as a result of that. And yet the government's still turning to these cloud cuckoo land solutions in terms of build to rent, particularly, to try to get out of it, when really the solution, in my opinion, is to fertilise the private sector, which provides 40% of our housing, to get them up and running and providing rental accommodation, which sort of makes sense. But again, it's an anathema to many of these policymakers who have this strange ideological view of the housing market and how it should perform as some sort of a government-controlled resource.
Well, the government said we're going to build 1.2 million new dwellings in the next 5 years. Well, they're not going to build any of them. They've got to encourage developers to do that. At the moment, construction costs are too high to make most new developments, especially the high-rise towers, financially viable. So again, sounds good, just like some of the rezoning suggestions from the New South Wales government sound good, but are they practical? Are they going to work, Andrew?
No, they're not. And these aspirational targets for the government, you're right, they don't build them. The private sector build them, and there's a systemic barriers to new supply in our country. The same issues in similar economies, the US particularly, planning restrictions, but there's red tape and green tape and all sorts of things. And as you mentioned, higher building costs are just adding to that load on new development. And I thought it was just really problematic, the latest policy thought bubble from the government in terms of fixing supply. We've had the build to rent, which will just create basically a handful of new dwellings, and they'll be controlled in terms of who rents them, and it'll be a controlled market environment, which doesn't work in this country. And the next policy has been to create higher levies for international developers, Michael. So international developers are going to be charged more. That's where the funding for the build to rent's going to come from, because governments have funded out of the public purse, of course, build to rent. But I would have thought that the higher levies for international developers will only be dissuade international developers from building. I mean, they can't live in them, international developers. Only those with a visa can live in them. So it's not as though they're taking them offshore with them. And the other point is international developers work within market forces. So they will build where people want to live and the types of developments that people want to live in, rather than these sort of Mickey Mouse build to rent type of developments, which are mixed use. They have to be to certain demographics, affordable rental, whatever that is. I don't think that exists in this country anymore. So it's all just as illogical that we're taking away from the market forces we need to provide development, even if they come from international developers, who cares, and creating more of this government controlled housing market model, which just hasn't worked. In fact, we can point to certain areas in Australia where these types of policies have been an utter failure, particularly mindful of the Townsville market. But once again, we don't seem to be learning the lessons. To me, as you said, Michael, as well, I think that these represent just almost desperate attempts to be seen to be doing something in the face of what is an extremely serious problem, particularly in our rental markets.
Well, one of the things you mentioned was a really quick way for the government to get more rental stock is supporting private investors, mums and dads, who provide the vast majority of rental accommodation. But that doesn't sound as politically correct. It's going to offend some people, when in fact it isn't necessarily rich people. We know most investors only get one or two investment properties into their portfolio, so it's not the mega rich that they're supporting. From what I can see, there's no end in sight to the rental shortage or the supply and demand imbalance, because all these measures, if they are going to work, are not going to happen anytime soon. We're already starting this year with a huge undersupply of dwellings.
Yes, Michael, I think it's interesting. And look, we have this sort of, governments and the media have created this sort of slumlord tag about private sector investors, which is far from the truth, as you said, in terms of the reality of who mainly investors are. I think it's just illogical that they wouldn't think, well, we're already giving incentives to private sector investments, tax depreciation, capital gains discounts, negative gearing. We already give relief to private sector investors who are risk takers. Why don't we just improve that to create more incentive? But no, we'd prefer to give it to the big end of town with rent to build scheme, which, as I said, are far from perfect if they work at all. But it's just, as I said, following this sort of ideological claptrap, which we've been sort of public out there are forced to, or have had thrown down their throats in terms of the negativity of Australia's landlords. But they're in short supply now, even with that 40% provision. But I think what's interesting, Michael, is that, and this is what government should take note of, is that we may start to see, and we're releasing our December rent report, December 2023 rent report next week, which we will discuss, Michael. We have seen some slight signs that vacancy rates were ticking upwards. Now, I don't think that's because we're getting any new supply into the market. I just think what we're seeing, which is an inevitability, is a change in the demand factors for rental properties. And that is that people, because they can't just keep paying 40, 50% of their income in rentals, we're not seeing any extra supply coming in, and we won't, as you said, for a lengthy period. I think that what we're seeing is potential tenants are making different choices now because they have to. They're having to choose smaller properties. In other words, they're going to have to go to where there are properties they can actually live in, because they've got to have a roof under their heads, or they're going to stay at home with mum and dad longer. They're going to move in with siblings. They're going to get a 2-bedroom, even though they've got 3 children, rather than a 3-bedder or 4-bed. You understand? It's just all these social changes. And I advise the government, if this is occurring, which I believe we're starting to see signs of, this will have a very significant political downput because people who can't house themselves, they're the ones at I guess, the lower end of the income scale. I'm not going to be very happy with governments in the first instance because that is a very serious problem for people. And we've already seen outcomes in Western Europe driven by similar concerns from constituents who've been unable to house themselves. So I think this is the future for housing. It's people are going to have to make choices which they normally wouldn't have because they just can't find anything suitable for their accommodation. And as I said, that might mean staying at home longer, moving in with relatives, having a different property in a different location they would normally do. And as I said, I think this has very significant shorter term political consequences.
I just wanted to remind you that this is not specific investment advice because we don't know your personal circumstances, but we're more than happy to have a chat to help you take advantage of this new property cycle. If you think about it, the opportunity like this to get set at the beginning of a new property cycle doesn't happen very often. So why not have an obligation-free chat with my team at Metropole to discuss your goals and to discuss your options. We're much more than just another buyer's agent. We help you safely create intergenerational wealth through property. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. And as we don't sell any properties, our advice is independent and unbiased. Now remember, property investment's a process. It's not an event. So you can't just go out and buy any property and hope to be successful. In fact, now more than ever, getting the right advice is critical. So if you're looking to invest in property or buy a new home, go to metropole.com.au and have a chat with our multi-award winning team. It's a great feeling having the team at Metropole on your side, levelling the playing field. Well, I see something else that's infiltrated our society in recent years, particularly, I guess, promulgated by a party with a green sort of colour in their background. Most of the 7 million Australians who live in rental accommodation, along with the 2.2 million Australians who personally funded 91% of the total's rental supply, they're good people. And for all the years, the relationship between landlords and tenants past seems to have been one of mutual respect. But recently, there seems to be more an us and them mentality. It's a rift that seems to come from a bit of a political agenda suggesting that Australians shouldn't look after their financial security by owning investment properties.
I think a lot of governments just get it wrong. It's driven by the media, the loud voices of the left, and I would suggest we'll be waving those governments goodbye pretty soon, as we are seeing in other jurisdictions. If they don't pay heed to this, and maybe it's too late now already, going forward, that we've created almost an insoluble problem by listening to the ideologues and buying into these sort of Mickey Mouse profiles of the housing market, which just do not reflect reality. And that said, we are completely different here, certainly to Western Europe, and those that have been looking at that as an example of the nirvana of housing markets are all being very, very quiet at the moment, Michael, seeing that those nirvana housing markets are really struggling. Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, Ireland are chronic undersupply, and we are seeing political ramifications as a result. Same sort of reason, of course, the US, particularly on the west coast of the US, a lot of people have to live in boxes, Michael.
Well, I guess people always look for excuses. So it's either the ugly, greedy landlords, or Andrew, it's the foreign investors. It's their fault that I can't afford a house as well. So I guess one of the lessons for 2023 is it's not going to change. There are going to be pessimists. But I think another lesson is that many Australians still aspire to own their own home. And if they take a long-term view and cut out all the short-term negativity, they're very likely to look back in 12 months' time and say, hey, I made a good decision. Andrew, I'm sure there's a lot of people today who would do things very differently in 2023 if they knew then, 12 months ago, what they know today.
Yeah, perhaps, Michael. But I think the big lesson learned was that robust and resilient housing market, yet again.
And don't try and time the market. Just get in.
Well, we said that regardless of interest rates a year ago that the market would be positive this year. And that wasn't just throwing a dart at the dartboard. A lot of predictors have dozens of different predictions, and when one of them comes in, oh, see, I predicted that. Yeah, but you also predicted all these other things which didn't happen. The point was that we had, people seem to forget, we had an extraordinarily strong 2021 housing market, which was the COVID boom, and the market came back from the lockdowns. People forget that we had 40% increase in Brisbane house prices during that period, 30% increase in Sydney, 35% increase in Melbourne. Massive year 2022. And of course, once we started to see all the pent-up demand from COVID easing, a lot of the buyers had come and gone. High prices had created affordability barriers, as it usually does. We saw an easing in the cycle. And then, of course, the negativity came in and people were frightened again by all those doom and gloom predictions. And housing markets, particularly Sydney and Melbourne in 2022, tracked backwards, but nothing like they were predicted to track backwards. And the net result over those 2 years, 2021, 2022, was still around about a 30% increase, 35% increase. But we didn't think about that. But it was a similar scenario this year, Michael, because we moved back into the market quicker than many were predicting, because there was these discounts available, particularly in the Sydney market, where prices had fallen 9% in 2022, and yet they've bounced back by 11% this year. And that's because buyers were driven by the value opportunities, the discounts in the market, regardless of higher interest rates. So it was just the cycle reinforcing itself, Michael. What goes down in Australian housing market, it comes back up again. And that's what we've seen in 2023, which was eminently predictable. And what we're seeing, of course, now is that we've moved beyond the catch-up energy. We'll move forward, but with a much more modest outcome this year in 2024. So as I said, it just lesson learned again was the resilience of our housing markets and just how the cycle that goes down. And I think the cycles are driven downwards a little bit more because of the preponderance of scare tactics in the media, but they come back pretty quick, even when the scare tactics are still there, because people realise, gee, this is a really good time to get into the market. We've seen that all this year, particularly in Sydney, and now we'll move forward in 2024, I think, with a much more stable, but still a positive market because of the factors we've spoken about today, Michael, particularly undersupply and the drive from migration remaining a force in our housing markets.
And anyone who wants a job has got a job. Yeah. Sure, their borrowing capacity has decreased considerably, but that doesn't mean they can't get into the market. You just got to maybe look at different sort of properties, maybe the next suburb, maybe an apartment, a villa, a townhouse rather than a house. But I think each week as we keep coming back to our regular Property Insider chats, we're going to find that it'll be another interesting year. Each one is. Let's see what lessons we can learn from 2024. Thanks for your time, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And just on that, gee whiz, you wouldn't want to be in the rental market, would you, if you could avoid it?
No. Well, I guess that's one of the factors that's going to support the housing market, because tenants are going to just have to make that decision and get out there and buy a house if they can afford it.
And further to what you said previously, Michael, the bank of mum and dad comes into play even more now.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Not only mum and dad, but also grandpa and grandpa, from what I understand. Thanks a lot, Andrew.
Thanks, Michael.